critical, timing is critical. And when we don't get that robust signal of daylight and darkness at night, then in fact the clocks in our body drift apart. And that's called something called circadian disruption. That is, everything's out of sync. It's like a discordant orchestra. When the conductor is not governing the orchestra, they're tuning up, and it's all these strange sounds. They're not playing in harmony together. When we're not in harmony, all sorts of fundamental body functions fall apart. We suffer more obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, breast cancers, prostate cancers, colorectal cancers, really are much higher in people with disrupted circadian rhythms. And quite frankly, if you've got obesity, because we didn't really talk about obesity, people gain weight under blue light significantly.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sara, and today's guest is Dr. Martin Moore-Ede, who's an MD and a PhD, and he has extensive research in circadian biology, and he led the team that identified the SCN, or the master clock, in the brain. Martin's going to walk you through the basics of our body clocks and why we have one and why it's important. And he's also going to explain what happens when we're exposed to the wrong light at the wrong time. Martin also discusses studies into artificial light, which can lead to diabetes, cancer, obesity, and mental health problems, and give practical advice on what you can do. This is a superb introduction by an expert on the effects of artificial light and disease, especially things like breast cancer and diabetes. So please share this with anybody you think that will benefit. Welcome to the channel, Dr. Moore-Ede. Do you want to introduce yourself to people who've not met you before? And I know you have a very extensive background in circadian biology.
Yeah, well, my name's Dr. Martin Moore-Ede, and I've been working for over 40 years in the field of circadian rhythms and the impact of light and the role in health. Both I've experienced from my experiences right from the very beginning when I graduated out of Guy's Hospital Medical School in the UK, and then went across the pond to Toronto to do my surgical residency, and was working 36-hour long shifts under bright fluorescent lights, and suffering all sorts of fatigue, and then on there to study the science of circadian rhythms, very new field. When I started my medical career, only 3 papers had been published in the year before about light and circadian rhythms, just to give you a scale. We're now in the thousands. And then that field really blossomed, and I went into it and had opportunity to really do some of the early work with a team of postdocs and graduate students at Harvard Medical School, where I was a professor for 23 years. And in turn, I also worked on the applications into the real world. And so first of all, we worked with people who work shifts around the clock. In other words, industries that are 24/7. I formed a consulting firm that worked in that now has offices around the globe. But as the evidence came along in the early 2000s, that it wasn't just light that was the problem, but it was particularly the blue wavelengths in light that are so critical to disrupting circadian clocks and causing the havoc and causing the excess disease associated with seeing the wrong light at the wrong time, that I then went back into determining what were the precise wavelengths, doing the science of figuring out which blue it was, and there are a lot of different blues, as we can talk about, but certain wavelengths of blue in around 480 nanometers. And again, I'll define that. That's how we actually measure blue. And then going from there to actually develop lights that could provide the blue that was so essential for health during the day, so essential for synchronizing circadian rhythms, and yet remove it from the light spectrum at night. And we developed light bulbs and light fixtures, and then licensed that to industry. The challenge is the science is well developed in this field. The knowledge is there. It is not a matter, it's not an emerging science. It's a well-established science. And yet most people don't know about it. And yet we have light bulbs today in the stores that are really harmful to our health. because government regulators and the industry is not building it. And why they're not building it is because people aren't demanding healthy light. And why aren't they demanding healthy light? Well, that's because they don't understand what it. So, Sarah, this conversation today is really to help people understand why having light with a healthy light spectrum that is appropriate to the time of day or night is so critical for our health. And one of the things I often say is that the light we see is as important to our health as the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. And just like there's lots of junk food out there, and there's a lot of people telling us the harmful effects of junk food, there's a ton of junk light out there. We need to be looking for healthy light. So that's the short story, and then we can dive in and as you wish to where we want to go.
Okay, great. That was very useful. Maybe if we could start by talking about how the body senses light and how that sets our circadian rhythm, and what is a circadian rhythm, what's an SCN, what's a clock gene, just so that people can be walked through the light being received and propagated through the body, and also why we have to have a body clock and a circadian rhythm in the first place.
Gosh, well, that's a college lecture course, but let's see what we can do. To start with, we're all fully aware of the light that we see. We're aware of light as a way to have visual experiences, be aware of the world around us, and so critical for, obviously, for our survival and for our fitness and our well-being, to be able to see where you're going and not trip over things, and to be able to enjoy all the things, whether it's the fine arts and paintings, or whether it's reading a book, or whether it's working on a computer screen, all the things the visual side of light. But there's a whole non-visual side of light. You might say, well, that's a bit strange. Well, the answer is light is having effects on our body that are really critical to our health, that are not to do with the vision or the visual perception of what we see. So, and those so-called non-visual effects of light are mostly coming in through the eyes, that there are special receptors in the back of our eyes called retinal ganglion cells, or more specifically, intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, quite a mouthful, IPRGCs. Those retinal ganglion cells, it turns out, have a pigment in them, a photopigment, which is maximally sensitive to blue, and it's a sky blue color they sense predominantly, and that's the key signal. And that sky blue color is, when that's received by these receptors in our eyes, it sends a message back to the master circadian clock, which is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. So the IPRGCs sending information through the retinal hypothalamic tract, the RHT, to the SCN. If we want to get into the acronyms, they sometimes make it easier to go with. And that master clock is not the only clock in the body. It is just the conductor of the orchestra. We actually have millions of circadian clocks in every cell and tissue and organ of our bodies. And when everything is working well, when we have beautiful, rich daylight and we're exposed to it and we're outdoors, as we were for the first 10,000 generations of humans' existence, we spend our time outdoors, and we sleep in the dark at night, as we did for the first 10,000 generations of human living, because there wasn't much in the way of light. There's certainly no electric light until 150 years ago. But before that, there was no electric light. And that experience of being blue rich during the day and no blue at night is the key to keeping our clocks synchronized, and is the key to keeping not only just the master clock synchronized, that means us synchronized with the outside world with day and night in our local time zone, but it's also the synchronization of all the cells in the body. The body is a critically timed machine, just like your computer or your car or anything else. It's critical. Timing is critical. And when we don't get that robust signal of daylight and darkness at night, then in fact the clocks in our body drift apart. And that's called something called circadian disruption. That is, everything's out of sync. It's like a discordant orchestra. When the conductor is not governing the orchestra, they're tuning up and it's all these strange sounds. They're not playing in harmony together. When we're not in harmony, all sorts of fundamental body functions fall apart. We suffer more obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, breast cancers, prostate cancers, colorectal cancers, really are much higher in people with disrupted circadian rhythms. And unfortunately, all those diseases, our immune system is impaired, and we live a shorter life. In other words, we die sooner. So those are well established now. So basically, and why is that? I mean, why, what's the problem? There's daylight outside and we can sleep in the dark at night if we choose. But the reality is we spend 90% of our time indoors under twilight levels of light. So the levels of light indoors are way, way less than outdoor light. So we don't get the strong day signal. And at night, a very large number of us, 40 to 50% or more, are sleeping with some lights on in the bedroom, whether it's a TV or a side light or whatever it is. And even a tiny amount of light in the bedroom actually radically increases your risk of disease and even shortens your life. So there are some important take-home lessons. Please switch off the lights in the bedroom at night, and please go outside to the rich daylight. Because if you don't do that, you get into this state of fatigue, of malaise, of ill health, and a lot of the diseases of modern life are quite frankly associated with the lack of a strong circadian day-night signal. So it's a very important subject, and we can dig into details of that. But it's vitally important to understand the core message of getting exposed to a very strong circadian day-night signal that keeps our bodies in sync.
Also, doesn't biology work on predicting the future? And because some processes in the body are quite slow to happen, is light not really important, or light signals really important for us to get ready for certain events? And that's why we also need to have a good circadian rhythm so that prediction can happen.
Absolutely. I mean, I gave a Bowditch lecture for the American Physiological Society back in 1980 something about that. In fact, one of the core functions of the circadian timing system is predictive homeostasis as opposed to reactive homeostasis. The body, you know, we keep our body temperature at a fairly steady level. We keep various other electrolytes and everything's in our body at fairly steady levels, a process called homeostasis. And the old time physiologists recognized that. But the model was, you know, if the temperature's too hot, our body warms us, cools us down. If it's too cold, our body warms us up. You know, it's reactive. But in reality, many of the synthesis of key proteins we need to perform certain functions in our body, whether it's digestion or whether it's repair and recovery, all have a lead time of being synthesized and delivered to the right place to do the right molecular biological function. And that timing is very critical. So having a clock inside us actually enables us to get ready for dawn before it occurs, get ready for night before it occurs. And that, of course, was critical in why that exists throughout the animal kingdom, because if you got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, you were just food for your predators. You know, you wouldn't survive. So really critical right from an early time.
Just before we move out of clocks, there are other mechanisms by which we sense the time. For example, doesn't the Schumann resonance play a role in setting the clock? And are there any deeper or secondary timing systems that aren't light dependent? I know that like frequency is also light, but just before we move on to the next part.
The strongest other cue for circadian clocks is actually food entrainment. That is a strong one. And in the absence of time cues, if you have a strongly timed nutritional diet, in other words, and that's one of the reasons why some of these restrictive timing of eating diets work and are helpful, because that does provide a strong synchronizing cue. There are probably other so-called time givers. They're called Zeitgebers, or it's a German word for, because of some of the original science is done in Germany, just meaning a time givers. But really the light and food are the biggest factors. Now, there are lots of other factors of light on our bodies. Light falling on our bodies has effects on metabolism in our skin tissues and our cells. I mean, you know, babies that are jaundiced, newborn babies, you know, you can reverse that by putting them out in sunlight. That's how it was discovered, but you could put it under blue light, and it will destroy the excess bilirubin and cure the babies of their jaundice. So there are a lot of different applications and various other aspects of the light spectrum, and we should really actually spend a moment on that, because most people look at light, they say, well, I don't really do much blue light. You know, no, you don't. But light that you perceive as white or yellowish, the typical, whether it's sunlight, daylight, or whether it's a light coming from a computer screen or from a light bulb or light fixture, that light is actually, you're not seeing white light. It doesn't, there's no such thing as white light. It is a visual perception in your brain of the mix of all the color wavelengths. So what's actually we are receiving from the sun or receiving from electric lights is all the colors of the rainbows, of wavelengths of all the colors, visible wavelengths, also some of the invisible ones. We get some ultraviolet, invisible, we get some infrared at the other end, but in between we get violet and we get blue and we get green and we get yellow, we get orange, we get red, each of which have specific effects in the body. So for example, when you look at the light spectrum, violet light is actually very effective at killing bacteria and germs and so forth. Some of the blue, as we mentioned, blue down at about 460 nanometers. By the way, just to put the scale of the visible light spectrum, it goes between about 380 nanometers to 780 nanometers, about a 400 nanometer range. And so down in the violets, you're down in the below 425. The blues are from about 425 to about 500. The greens are from 500 to about 570 or somewhere around there. Then you go to the yellows, the reds are up in the 600s. So basically, the violet light cures, you know, can destroy bacteria and has other effects. The blue in the sky blue colors have a specific, and that's around 480 is specifically what is synchronizing our circadian clocks, what we talked about earlier. Green light is actually very effective at reversing migraines and other pain, other neurological pain. It's quite interesting that green is the most potent way of doing that. When you go to the red light, that is actually will heal scars and heal and make your hair grow, and it's a healing process. And infrared, there's more healing up in there too, with now used in new techniques called photobiomodulation. So actually, when you're going outside, you're getting a lot of light, and B, you're getting the full spectrum of all those and all the health effects of the broad spectrum of light. Now, one of the things we should touch on is another term called lux, because it's a useful one, or at least it's frequently used, but it's got some significant interpretive problems to it. Lux is a measure of how bright light is. So, and so when you're indoors, typically, and we talked about living indoors and twilight levels indoors, we're typically living at, you know, somewhere around 200 to 400 or so lux of light indoors. That is really dim as compared to outdoor light. Even on a cloudy day, it is 10,000 lux of light bright. And if you're outdoors on a sunny day, you can be 50,000 to up to 100,000 lux of light. So you're getting way more light, way more bright light when you're outdoors than when you're indoors. And at night, you know, moonlight is down at a fraction of a lux of light. Even that's the brightest light you're going to see outside. And yet, you know, here we are in the evenings shining that same 200 to 300 lux of light on ourselves and so forth. Now, the thing you have to watch for is lux is only a measure of the brightness of light. And similarly, it's related to lumens, which is how much comes out of the light bulb, how light bulbs are measured in lumens. But the really warning is you have to look for that, look at it carefully, because that is actually only measuring the green and yellow wavelengths. That's all that they're measuring, because that's what the human eye is perceiving as brightness, green and yellow. That's all it's looking at. It does not measure, lumens or lux do not measure at all the blue wavelengths, which are so important to circadian clocks. It doesn't measure at all the red wavelengths, that are so important to healing and restoration. So it's measure of brightness. And unfortunately, our engineers in our society who don't understand biology are focused on trying to get energy efficiency in terms of lumens of light per watt of electricity. And so if you just totally focus on that, you actually create this very artificial light. This is why I talk about junk light, that does not provide the right blue content. And it does not provide adequate blue content during the day, and it delivers way too much blue content at night. And that's all. And the regulations now are banning some of the older forms of light, like incandescent light bulbs and halogens, which actually had much less blue in them, and hence were safer to use in the evenings. And compared to candles and wood fires, by the way, they have less than 1% blue. Modern LEDs have 15, 20, sometimes 20%, 25% blue even in them. And that's part of the problem here. We've got measures that are wrong. We're focused on global warming and climate change, very important issues, but we're trying to produce the amount of bright light, but unfortunately we're producing junk white light rather than healthy light. And that's another part of this equation as well.
Oh, definitely, because it's all about not just energy, but it's about information. And the light bulb is providing extremely poor information for our system. Before we move on, I was going to ask you maybe to just touch on things like optical density and kelvins, because these are different ways that people might have heard light being expressed, and maybe what's a high energy photon. And then we can move forward, because I like it when I get an optics expert on, because they can always explain things better than I can in a nice sort of simple way. And there's lots of words that get thrown about and people don't actually know really what they mean, and then they never can completely understand a conversation about light or physics. And maybe if you could walk us through that briefly.
Well, first of all, I'm going to disqualify myself. I'm not an optical physicist, so I'm a humble MD, PhD professor of physiology by background, right? So that's my background. But essentially, I think important point here, when you look at a light bulb in the store, it's going to tell you lumens, and it probably will tell you watts. So it'll tell you lumens and watts. We talked about that, but it also will tell you CCT, which is coordinated color temperature. And that basically is a definition of what the light is that's being produced, measured in kelvins, so that if you go from, and that does loosely, but not very well, relate to blue content. So people will talk about warm light, and it gets more yellow, more yellow orange at one end. That's very low Kelvin light, low color temperature light. And light that is at the other end will get increasingly harsher and bluish. And that's when you get up to 6,000 Kelvin sometimes. And you could provide yourself with, 6,000 Kelvin blue rich light during the day, and, 2,000 Kelvin yellow-orange light during the evening hours. It's a very inefficient way to solve the problem, and it also really impacts the visual. It's very, very uncomfortable. Number one, the bluish harsh are really hard on the eyes at the high Kelvins, and the very low ones are really hard to see by or have really impact visual acuity. So one of the things we've worked on is getting people normally prefer lights that are used to somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Kelvin on the CCT, the coordinated color temperature scale. Unfortunately, that's what lights are sold. They're sold by metrics that really don't tell you very much about their health at all. That's the problem. The lights that we've developed and did a lot of work on is actually producing lights in that 3,000 to 4,000 range that either have lots of the correct blue, the sky blue color in them, or lights that are, in that same range, but produce zero or near zero blue. In other words, the level of blue that's in candlelight or in wood fire, which, by the way, our ancestors for many years, that's all the light they had. And it didn't cause any problems at night because there was virtually no blue in it. But those are the sort of things. Now, there are a variety of other ways of measuring light in terms of photon flux and so forth, different scales. I won't try to get into all the details of that, but there are other measures. But mostly what you're going to see when you out there choosing lights is going to be lumens, you're going to see watts, and you're going to see CCT in Kelvin.
Oh, that's great, because I think so far, for people who've been following, we want it bright with the right kind of light in the daytime, and then we want it dark at night. So maybe if you'd like to now walk us through how the wrong light is harmful for health, and just starting with, we've mentioned food already, and also sleep, because we all have to eat and sleep, and people are interested in things like that. And just before we dive into cancer and diabetes and get more technical.
Well, the central thing that happens when you are not getting adequate blue-rich light during the day, and remember, we are talking about regular whitish, yellowish light, but whether it containing a lot of blue like daylight does. If you're not getting that, then what's happening is that let's talk about the digestive system first of all, and metabolism. If you are exposed to blue light containing blue in the evening hours, you actually have a higher appetite. We've found that people get more hungry as compared to the same light at the same brightness, visual brightness, but doesn't contain blue, they get more hungry. If we've looked at people in the workplace, they're eating twice as many snacks on the night shift or late evening shifts as the people who are under blue depleted light. They have far less gastrointestinal disorders when that happens, when you're in blue-free light, as compared to blue-rich light in the evenings, because the body's getting totally the wrong signal. But also, we can look at the metabolism and the diabetic axis by measuring glucose levels in the body and insulin levels. A classic way of doing that, of course, if someone has diabetes, what's happening is that they are the key test, it's called the glucose tolerance test, typically done first thing in the morning. You turn up fasting but with no breakfast, you drink a bottle of sugar water, and then every half hour or so they take a blood sample and they measure glucose and insulin. And a normal person, the glucose and insulin will climb up within the first hour or so, and then go back down to baseline again by the end of about 2 hours. That's the normal response. But if you're diabetic, then those glucose and insulin levels will go higher, and then will stay up after 2 hours. So that basically that's the test, the sort of diagnostic test. Well, guess what? You can take a bunch of perfectly healthy, non-diabetic people, put them in a room with standard LED lights at night, and you can render them pre-diabetic by the morning. In other words, they'll have a diabetic type glucose tolerance test. And that's just from the exposure light. So that's a very rapid effect, that particular effect, very rapid onset effect. And then a lot of other conditions will develop over time with longer exposure to that. But that's one of the things we can demonstrate almost immediately.
Oh, that's so interesting, because I suppose once people have got insulin resistance, it's now going to have a cascading effect on their sex hormones, leptin, and all sorts of other hormones. But the trigger or the cause was actually light. And we can sort of, people blame all sorts of things for funny hormones, but I just think you put it very sort of succinctly and clear. That, just moving on from blood sugar and insulin and metabolic issues, how is sleep impacted? And maybe if you want to talk about the importance of melatonin, its conservation through evolution, and the consequence of not having enough melatonin.
Well, let's go back to that pathway we talked about. Blue light coming through the eyes is detected either containing blue or not by those retinal ganglion cells, pass to the SCN. The next stage is the messages go out to the pineal gland, which produces melatonin, and they also go down the pituitary adrenal axis and result in the release of cortisol. Now, melatonin is the hormone that is produced at night. It peaks around 2 o'clock in the morning. People mistakenly call it the sleep hormone. It's not. It's actually the darkness hormone. It is the hormone that is telling the body that it's dark outside. If there's light, if you're exposed to light, then your melatonin is suppressed. It doesn't come out. It can be way, way lower. The cortisol, and so the melatonin is the night hormone. Cortisol is a key synchronizer for dawn. And we talked about the predictive feature. It happens, starts climbing a few hours before, an hour or so before dawn, peaks around dawn. And that is the key signal that tells the body it's time to wake up, that it's, that it's daytime. So we've got these hormonal systems, messages throughout coursing through our systems of the body, through our blood supply to all the organs, and keeping everything in sync. So those are the internal messages. Now, melatonin is a very interesting thing. It is associated with repair and with helping the body recover after the day of exposure and trauma. But it also is suppressing cancer cells, among other things. And so if we suppress the melatonin, cancer cells in our body grow much faster. So that's another side of it. So basically those hormones and there are a variety of other hormones as well that are peaking at different times, providing signals. But those are two of the examples of how this whole system is so finely tuned and has this internal synchronization mediated by these hormonal rhythms.
I want to thank my sponsor, Lightwater Scientific, who helped me deliver free valuable information to you and also allow me to have great guests on this channel. Lightwater Scientific produce the purest and most deuterium-depleted water in the world. Depleting or lowering your deuterium has numerous health benefits, from better metabolic health, more energy, greater resilience, less brain fog, increased physical performance, enhanced healing, and healthier mitochondria. Deuterium is an isotope of hydrogen, also known as heavy water, because it's bigger and heavier than regular hydrogen. Even though deuterium makes up only 0.02% of hydrogen, it's found everywhere. Deuterium is a burden to your body because it interferes with the intricate chemical reactions that occur by slowing them down. Deuterium is kryptonite to your mitochondria, and we need healthy mitochondria to produce energy. There's over 60 years of scientific research on the negative effects of too much deuterium on health, and also the positive benefits of lowering deuterium in the body. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water is 100% safe and non-toxic. In fact, it's the closest in structure to the metabolic water that your mitochondria produce. Lightwater deuterium-depleted water comes in 5 or 10 parts per million glass or plastic bottles. So level up your health by leveling down your deuterium today. The purchase link is in the show notes, and use code Dr. Sara for a discount off your order. That leads very nicely now into cancer, because if we now have got a deficit of melatonin and say an insulin resistant state in the body, it's going to open people wide to cancer. And I've heard you talk before about how there's this dramatic increase in breast cancer, and the epidemiological data or the studies very strongly suggest it's women and men as well who are exposed to electrified light, because they in areas where women and men aren't exposed to electric light, there aren't incidences of breast cancer. So maybe you want to sort of elaborate on that. And also, I think, isn't prostate a very similar pattern as well?
It is, yes. So to be clear, it's a bit like lung cancer, where most of the cases of lung cancer are related to the toxic effects, right, of smoking. But 20% of lung cancer cases occur in non-smokers. So there is a certain level. It's not zero in non-smokers. In the same way, women who've never been exposed to electric light rarely get breast cancer. Now, and therefore it's a rate that's like 20 women per 100,000 women get it, as compared to in fully electrified societies like we have in Europe and England and North America. In those societies, there's around 100 to 120,000 20 women. In other words, 5 to 6 times more women are getting breast cancer in those societies because they're in an environment exposed to light. You might say, well, how do you know that? Well, let's look at women who've never seen light. Number one, before electric light was developed, breast cancer was a really quite rare disease. Number two, women who live in those parts of the world where electrification has not yet happened. And there are millions of people living still without electricity in sub-Saharan Africa and other places in the world. And those women very rarely get breast cancer, very low rates. The other one, which is a really interesting one, because you could say, well, we've got lots more things going on and toxins, environment and pollutants and other things. There's a difference between living in darkest Africa and living in, Western Europe. Well, no, if you look at women who have been blind since an early age, they also rarely get breast cancer, which is fascinating because they're, of course, exposed to all the other pollutants. The only thing different is the light that's coming in through there that they're able to detect and perceive in their eyes. So that is, and that effect is so large that it could account for, up to half the cases of breast cancer in the world today could be associated with electric light. Now, you could say, well, okay, is there really mechanisms there? Well, yes, there's been some very, very elegant studies on this. We know that melatonin suppresses cancer cells. For example, if you take human breast cancer and implant it in mice, so the mice now are carrying a human breast cancer, which will grow, and metastasize and so forth. What then happens is if those mice are have exposed to light at night, then their breast cancer grows much faster than if they're in darkness at night. But even more interesting was a study where they took women who were, I think most of them were nurses, and they either sat in a room at night in the dark, or they sat in a room at night with the lights fully on. And then they took blood samples from these women. Of course, the women who sat in the dark had very high levels of, normal high levels of melatonin in the blood. And the women who sat in the light at night had suppressed very low levels of melatonin. Shipped those blood samples down to the lab where the mice were, and now infuse those blood samples from the women either with high melatonin or low melatonin into the rats or mice. Lo and behold, the high melatonin receiving rats, breast cancers didn't grow nearly as fast. The ones with the human blood that contains very little melatonin, cancers grew much more quickly. Fascinating study because it really sort of illustrates the whole pathway. And so we know we've got a very good sense of the mechanisms here that are involved. It's also true for prostate cancer, as you mentioned. Colorectal cancer seems to be another one. So who are the people who get most highest rates of breast cancer? Well, it's actually people who work night shifts. That was how it was first found. Some 3 big studies done in the last century, in other words, before 2000, with the results reported in the year 2000, all 3 of them showed 50% or more increase in breast cancer in women working in the night shift. You might say again, well, people working the night shift, they've got, different occupational environmental risks and everything else. Well, what's interesting is the same thing happens in women sleeping in their beds at night with the bedroom lights on. So they're not working the night shift, they're getting the same light, they're getting light at night. And so that again is another proof, and it's again, it's true for men. So basically men working night shifts get the highest rates of prostate cancer, or men who sleep in with the lights on at night also to get it. And it's really quite a small amount of light. A recent study come out from the Biobank study, 85,000 people, were a fascinating study, large scale, 85,000 people. They've got light meters on them, tracking them continuously 24/7, how much light they're getting. And they find out who are the people who get exposed to the most light at night and who are sleeping in the pitch darkness at night. And then they track them for the next 10 years and figure out, what happens to them. Well, lo and behold, they develop more diabetes more rapidly. If you've had the lights at night, they die sooner, which is really interesting. That lifespan is shortened. And so all these things are happening as a result of it. So there's some fascinating studies. Another study done in Sweden, which these large-scale studies have been very instructive. 29,000 Swedish women were studied with the intention of really demonstrating how much risk there was from people going outside and getting skin cancers. And this was it's a skin cancer study. And so they follow these women and see who spent more time outside regularly every day and who, tended to stay indoors or ready to go outside. And they tracked these women again for 10 years or so. And they found that the women who were spending time outside got more skin cancers, but they lived longer. I mean, this was years longer. And the effect of going outside every day was as big an effect, a difference versus staying indoors, as smoking or not smoking. That scale of magnitude in terms of lifespan. So again, these are all the studies that are pointing to how absolutely essential it is to get some exposed to daylight. Now I can go on if you want me to go on into what time of day.
You read my mind. I was just going to ask you about sunrises and UVA rises and solar noon and sunsets and the significance of the different properties of light now that people know all about lumens and lux and wavelengths at these different times of day and what they do.
Well, it so happens the human circadian clocks, if left their own devices, in other words, we'd put you in a cave. Down in the early studies were putting people in caves without any knowledge of time in the outside world, without any regular clocks or anything controlling day and night. And they found that they tended to sort of have longer days, 25 hours, sometimes longer days. And so they sort of gained an hour every day because the clock naturally drifts most people longer than 24 hours. And the same thing has been done. We did studies back in the 80s and people in a time-free apartment with no clocks, no windows, nothing to tell you the time of day, and then track people. Again, they drift longer. So the natural tendency is to drift longer. When light interacts with us, it does it according to what's called a phase response curve, a PRC. That's a technical phrase which just basically means when you get exposed to light, what effect does it have on the clock? In the mornings, it actually shifts the clock earlier. It advances the time of the clock. In other words, morning light sends you from America towards Europe, whereas evening will send you from Europe towards America, westward. In other words, so there's in the middle of the day, there's not so much sensitivity, but it's the morning, which will actually shorten your circadian rhythms back to the normal 24. Since we normally tend to run at 25, that's the light you need now. And that's the most effective time to get out. If you're balancing the risks of skin cancer and other things, avoid the midday sun, the really bright, harsh time like that. The time to get out actually is in the morning, the first part of the morning, before the sun has really risen to its peak. And the health consequences of that on psychiatric, haven't really talked about psychiatric illness, but one of the big impacts of having too little light in the daytime is increase in depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and other types of psychiatric illnesses are 30% more at risk if you don't get light during the daylight, and 30% less more at risk if you get also a separate effect if you get light exposure during the nighttime hours. Anyway, so here's the study. You look at people who are admitted to psychiatric hospital because they've got severe depression, severe anxiety. They've got to be medicated. They've got to be admitted to a psychiatric ward. And that psychiatric ward happens to have, the hospital happens to have half the windows are facing south and east. In other words, they're getting the morning sun. The other half of the windows, the other side of the corridor, are facing north and west. And they, of course, don't get the morning sun. The most remarkable finding, and this has now been repeated more than once, is the people who are in the rooms with windows facing south and east, getting the morning sun, getting this morning light, leave the hospital in half the time. They have the same medications, the same doctors, the same therapy sessions, but they get better in half the time. And this is one of the great tragedies of our modern world. One of the places we're least well advanced in terms of lighting is our hospitals. Our hospitals have the worst lighting and shine it on you way too long. And, you know, we could actually halve, you know, certain types of the hospital stays for certain conditions in half the time, get people get better. And yet that's been something, as I say, it's not really penetrated through into my profession, the medical profession. One of the frustrations there about this. We've had much more uptake in industries that work 24/7. We've installed proper circadian lighting in over 65 Fortune 500 companies in their key control centers and so forth, with great results. But hospitals are really a hard nut to crack.
And also, to make it worse in the hospitals, you can't open the windows anymore, because I already heard about the people with the mental health problems and being on the east or the west side of the hospital. So I imagine the windows were shut and they only received the blue light for the timings that you've been talking about, because the UV would have been blocked and also most of the red. So even if the window isn't open and just the sort of blue end of the spectrum gets through, it still had a 50% sort of improvement rate in when people left the hospital.
The staggering thing is, you look back at Florence Nightingale, you know, and she wrote a book on nursing in about 1860, I guess it was. And she got it right. She already knew that and wrote in her book, the most important things is fresh air, you know, for the health and recovery of patients, getting fresh air, number one, and getting exposed to sunlight during the day, you know, number two, right? Those are the most important things. And that was long before we had any other, you know, most of the medicines and procedures and antibiotics weren't invented in those days. But, you know, there was the fundamental thing already known, you know, in the 1860s.
Oh, there have been all sorts of people throughout the decades who've been great fans of going outside in sunlight, but still, like you've said, for some reason, those who are responsible for looking after the health of the nation don't seem to know. Do you think that the information's being filtered through, or do you think people are choosing not to take any notice because it would be potentially expensive to have to change the lightings in train stations and hospitals and pretty much everywhere? What's the barrier? Is it money or is it knowledge?
Well, I think knowledge is one of the key things. I also think there's money issues too, but that solves itself because anything in mass production becomes cheaper. But basically, where we are right now is the science is now well established. I mean, one of the things I always faced when I start talking about this subject is, well, MooreEde, is this your own set of crackpot theories and opinions? You know, do you represent what the science is? Well, the answer is, I said, well, the way to solve that one is I invited all the scientists who published more than 4 peer-reviewed scientific publications on circadian rhythms and light to join in a consensus study. And we came up with about 250 scientists who were agreed on key statements about light. In other words, so all this evidence we talked about, the blue, we talked about the retinal ganglion cells, the circadian SCN being synchronized by blue light, the harmful effects of blue light in the evenings. And this group came up with a conclusion that, LED lights that contain a lot of blue should have a warning label saying, do not, may be harmful if used at night. We should use lights that are free of blue. All the things I've been talking about, supported by this consensus group of scientists. So the scientists know. Very insightfully, one of my colleagues said, the scientists all know this. And by the way, 30,000 scientists now have co-authored papers in this field. I mean, it's not a small number of people in total that have been involved in science over the last 20 years in this area. Those scientists all talk to each other and all agree, but they never talk to their neighbors. So the problem is there's a lack of awareness. So, I just meet anybody I meet. My wife has a habit of going around and, picking up conversations with people in restaurants and everywhere else and say, well, do you know about this? And no one ever does. Even really educated people, don't have a clue about this most of the time. This is why podcasts like this are so essential. But it's a science is well established. Now, the problem is, if there isn't a demand for something, it's very hard for industry to supply it. So the technology now exists. We know exactly how much blue light we need. We've actually got light bulbs and light fixtures that do the job, that actually can provide healthy lighting. They've been proven now for over 5 years in a wide variety of situations. There's a lot of published research on that, very well established. But the industry itself is still 99.8% producing junk light, non-healthy light. And their argument is, well, unless the consumer's asking for it, we can't risk going out there and putting stuff on the shelves that people won't buy. So there really is a chicken and egg problem. We've got to educate, and so people are demanding it, equip them with the knowledge to know what to ask for. And one of the things I do in my book, The Light Doctor, which I urge all your listeners to get a copy of and read, is it provides a sort of guide for the normal person to be able to explain this thing and to be able to have some material to give to their boss or to whoever else is in charge of the hospital or whatever else to do this. Because if you've got to have the demand for it, then the industry will respond. The industry won't respond unless there's demand, and now we get stuck in this unhealthy trap. And then, of course, in the short term, this type of light is more expensive because if you produce it in small quantities, it's less expensive. There's no reason that just with sheer volume, the price won't come down. So we're at this tipping point. We've got to we're not at the tipping point. We've got to get to the tipping point and really move forward here. And so I have a website called circadianlight.org, which provides information on where you can get these types of lights and what the resources are, and I try to keep it up to date. But essentially, it's an education campaign. So I wrote my book, The Light Doctor, using light to boost your health, improve your sleep, and live longer, to really educate people on this whole issue and really use it as a vehicle, as a tool to educate others. And so it's on Amazon, it's readily available. So I urge people to look for that book because that will help it. And I hope we're trying to, sort of create a campaign for healthy lighting, because our hospitals, our schools, our elder care homes really vitally need to have this, because it would really cut the disease and ill health and the experienced by these people. It's already been shown that circadian lighting, that light that's low and blue at night and rich in blue during the day, cuts the number of falls by a very large amount of elderly patients in senior living homes, just that thing alone. So it's really time to adopt this. And so I'm so glad, Sarah, that you're able to get this word out through your audience.
Oh, definitely, because the thing about the light and the problem, because a lot of the time, and with humans, we have to have a problem to want to do something about it. Whereas with the blue light, it causes metabolic problems, which people don't like, obesity, cancer, which people are frightened of, hormone disruption, which women and men complain about all the time, insomnia is rife. Nobody likes having depression or anxiety. And then I think you just mentioned then about falls in the elderly. I think that was interesting. And then I was going to say, are there any links to pain being increased with blue light exposure? Because I'd imagine if you don't sleep properly, the chances of pain the next day are increased. I think that's already proven. And then at the same time, before we finish, about skin, because I work with people and with teenagers and acne, I have noticed that the more screens and blue light they are exposed to, the worse the acne is. So it covers the entire sort of generations, all of these problems. And it's so simple, like you say, to do something about it. And people seem to just not know or not care.
Right. Well, it's, compared to other environmental pollutants, and we're all worried about things like PFAS chemicals, those
Oh, yeah.
forever chemicals, or microplastics, right? And those are horrendous problems to clean up. I mean, they're really difficult to clean up. But this is so simple. Change the darn light bulb. I mean, it is so simple, and so this is why this is something that can be reversed readily if only people understood what they're dealing with. Now, I mean, it affects so many things. It affects your immunity, right? Your immune systems, which is fundamental. Affects your general well-being. If you need another incentive, if you've got teenage kids and struggling with their math, you might be interested in a recent study which used another way, by the way, of controlling, we haven't talked about it, but controlling blue light in the evenings. If you don't have the light bulb, is to use blue blocking glasses. But you can make sure it's the right blue blocking, because there's a lot of placebo blue blocking out there that does no good whatsoever. It's got to block the blue that is responsible for circadian clocks. So typically, those are going to look yellow orangey in color glasses. Anyway, you give kids the glasses in the evening to block the blue light. And you also give them some, in this case, this study, they gave them a light box that provided blue light in the mornings, right, for when they were waking up, having their breakfast. And guess what? Those kids basically slept better and so forth, but their math scores in school went up significantly. And they did a lot of MRI studies, their brain connectivity and all sorts of other things they were able to show. But the tangible benefit, having your math scores go up just by protecting yourself from blue light at the time that you really should not be seeing it. And teenagers do stay up late and get a lot of blue light.
Oh, definitely. On the subject of children, what about ADHD and autism and blue light, or is that something for another conversation?
Well, that's another whole topic, but I mean, I think there are linkages to all of that. I think we'd have so much more good health, if we've been benefited. What happens since the 1800s? Public health has been better. The quality of our water is better. When the private equity firms aren't screwing it up. But basically, yes, the quality of water, the medicines we're able to have, a lot of major advantages in clean food, clean water, and everything else. But we've gone the wrong direction with light. We used to have healthy lighting, much more natural daylight, and no blue lights in the evenings. We used to have that. So we've gone the reverse direction there. I think we get a lot better, healthier population with less demand on the health service, if only we actually now address light and treat it as important as food, water, and air.
Or maybe more important, because it's actually so simple. But how about, are there any studies on blue light and poor lighting in prisons or with violence and crime? And because I've heard that there's a possible link.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the challenges, and we've actually looked at putting lights in some prisons because of it. They put people in prison when they're first there. They put them in some holding area. They keep them with harsh blue, rich lights, LED lights on 24/7. It just creates havoc. And anybody with any psychiatric condition is rendered worse and drives people off the scale, and of course that then leads to more violence and more other problems, and less ability to control. So yeah, I know prisons is a big area. Any type of residential facility is important. Colleges, when they have the lights on, and blue rich lights are exacerbating the tendency for people to stay up late and get there really sleep deprived. Yeah, no, it's across society, and it's so important. But we don't, as I say, very few people do it. When people do it, I've heard many cases of people, being so much more healthier, women being able to get pregnant and all sorts of things, when they really control their lighting environment. And there are people who are studying that whole issue as a vital part. So there are a lot of benefits and what we're doing back is basically going back, using our technology to properly replicate nature, not, totally go against the natural lighting that our bodies were designed for. Absolutely critical.
Exactly, because it affects nature as well. Our pets, we're subjecting them to poor lighting and shortening their lives. And then the other group who we haven't mentioned would be pregnant women, because there must be some correlation between inappropriate blue light exposure and maybe possibly something like autism via the retinol connection, because doesn't blue light wreak havoc on that pathway as well? Or are there studies on pregnancy?
Well, I'm not. Yeah, there's certainly studies on pregnancy and labor and other things about the exposure to light exposure and the timing of light exposure. I think we know, there's so much more to uncover. The principle is, a lot of things get better when you, get your lighting diet. And we like to call it a lighting diet. In other words, what is your light diet? It is sleeping in the dark at night. It's getting up in the morning and going outside and getting exposed to natural daylight, ideally for an hour, if you can do it, at least. Being able to increase the blue richness of working near windows if you can. Office cubicles are terrible. People sleep far worse when they're in office cubicles. Sleep at night far worse at home than the executive with the windowed office. And then when you get into the evening hours, making sure that you've got a blue-free environment, that lighting is zero blue in the evening hours, and then again, as I say, sleep in the dark. So that's the whole light diet that we really need to follow as a basic principle. And as I say, my book, The Light Doctor, tells you where to find it, what types of alternative ways you can achieve it, and so forth.
And then also there's the screens, the iPads and the iPhones and the laptops. But what do you think about software like Iris and Flux? Or do you prefer blue blockers?
Well, I think that the real issue is we talked about CCT, or coordinated color temperature.
Yes.
What all they're doing really is, most of those screens that change color are changing the color temperature, but not enough. There's still a lot of blue light coming through.
Right.
There's a bit of placebo going on. Now, there are computer screens coming under development right now, which truly remove the blue and yet have a pretty normal visual experience during the nighttime. In fact, they just automatically change. You shouldn't have to, it's like one of these automatic things. You should not have to think about it. It should just, your technology should do it for you and give you blue-free evenings and nights and give you blue-rich days.
Is that the daylight computer? You mean the computer that's coming out that's genuinely blue light free?
Well, there are ones coming out. I know of some under development that are coming out with, as I say, which control it versus day versus. The important thing is it's timed appropriately, so it matches sunrise and sunset in the outdoor world.
Okay. It's been really wonderful to talk to you. Is there anything else you'd like to say to anybody that might be listening? Because I know you work consulting, helping people set up work environments correctly, and you have, I think, is it correct, you have a light bulb range as well?
Well, yeah, my technology that we invented out of this, we then licensed out to major lighting companies, because we wanted to make it generally available. And we have got now, and as I say, the website circadianlight.org will give you sort of vehicle to get into that. What I also have a column on Substack that I write, a newsletter. And I'd urge you there to look at that, if people look at that. That's a newsletter that I've got thousands of subscribers now, where I can update you on what the latest science is, as well as what the new technologies and tools that are coming out and new products that are coming out, because this is a very much an evolving area right now.
Oh, absolutely. You can self-promote as much as you like. Don't hold back, because I think it's such an important subject and people are interested, and the people are always showing their friends videos. And I just think, tell people as much as you can of where they can find you, get information from you. Don't hold back. So that you've got a Substack, a book, your lighting company.
Yeah, well, I've got Instagram, of course, YouTube, all those things. Yeah, LinkedIn's. So I've got some social media people who chop stuff up and send it out, and which and really sort of provide the information in various channels. So we've got a campaign, really to get people aware of this, because it's so simple to fix, and yet so few people are aware of it. And as I say, the industry won't produce the stuff in volume at decent prices, unless there are enough people really asking for it. And that's the challenge right now. It's getting over that hump. Absolutely. But it's available now. And quite frankly, if you've got obesity, because we didn't really talk about obesity, people gain weight under blue light significantly. But if you've got obesity or diabetes and you're using one of these new drugs like Ozempic, and in America, people have to pay $600 to $800 a month out of their pockets for this. Go and buy a light bulb. It's a lot cheaper, to fix the problem.
Yes, that's the other thing. I know what people will do absolutely anything for weight loss, including surgery and strange drugs, yet it's so simple about light driving metabolism. But thank you so much for doing this podcast at quite short notice. And I think because it's such an important one, I'd urge people to share it with the so-called non-believers of light, because you've highlighted pretty much every person, or we've talked about every possible demographic and a multitude of diseases. And I just think it's so important that people become aware of it's a real science. It's very simple to fix. It's not something that's, like you said, you made up. It's a very strong science, and I hope it continues to grow.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.
It's been good talking with you.
Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful. Make sure you check out Martin's book and his Substack. I also have a Substack on quantum biology, and it starts right from the beginning, so it's beginner friendly, and the majority of the content is free. I've also got a brand new basic quantum biology course, which is suitable for anybody, and it also gives you practical methods in which you can implement certain quantum aspects in your life. And this course comes with a free 15-minute Zoom if that's something that you need because you got stuck and have questions. My minerals course also now comes with a free 15-minute Zoom call if you need any extra help, and the links are in the description.